next decade. National debt is insane. It's at $34.5 trillion.
All the areas.
The budget projects an average deficit of $1.6 trillion per year over the next decade. National debt is insane. It's at $34.5 trillion.
All the areas that we need to cut, we can't even have a conversation about, so they'll never get cut and they'll keep growing. I think that we probably need to figure out what the alternatives are. If you can't have a conversation about expenses, the only logical place is to have a conversation about revenues. What that means for the government is in taxation. I don't know, Jason, what we do here. There could be a couple of saving graces. There are some things happening, for example, on the Medicare side that could be profoundly disruptive. They are, again, I'm just going to put this out there as it's happening. I don't know if it's good or bad, but they are looking at reimbursing things like Wegovy and Ozempic and whatnot. If you look at the underlying costs of those kinds of chronic diseases, diabetes, heart disease, etc., and you put a large swath of the American population on those drugs, the reimbursement value of those drugs versus the cost of actually the chronic care management would save you many hundreds of billions of dollars a year. That's something. Second is on the defense side, there's a large portion of that budget that's migrating away from traditional tactical warfare to things that are unmanned vehicles and cyber and whatnot. That could save $200 or $300 billion there. So there are places where you could save $500 billion to $1 trillion, but I think it's going to be an almost impossible conversation and it'll happen by accident. So then the only forced conversation that I think we are going to have as a society is around taxation. And that's really bad for, a lot of people that don't believe that's the path to generating growth.
One of the challenges is that there are well-researched economic studies that show that when a government tries to increase the taxation level north of 20% of GDP of that economy, that you actually see GDP growth go negative. There's a certain natural equilibrium on which you can tax the system. Beyond that level, investment dollars go down and growth begins to shrink. And that's what triggers the spiraling problem, because then the government spending needs to go up to continue to grow and support growth in the economy. And it creates this inevitable spiraling.
There's a Fred chart showing percent of GDP that's federal tax receipts and then percent of GDP that's spending. And then the gap is your deficit. And Freeberg's right that I think in the absolute best economy, or best years of the best economy, so it's like, the best year of the Reagan boom and the best year of the Clinton boom when we had the government surplus, I think the government was extracting just shy of 20% of GDP. And in the 70s, when marginal tax rates were at 70%, so before the Reagan tax cuts, we were actually extracting a lower percentage of GDP. So there's only so much blood you can get from a stone. If you raise tax rates on a marginal basis high enough, the economy performs worse and you actually end up collecting less, or people spend a lot more money on lawyers and accountants to basically figure out more structuring schemes to avoid paying taxes. So the years in which we've got the highest percentage of revenue out of the economy are in good economic years where we've had reasonable levels of taxation as opposed to the highest levels of taxation. And so the problem is with the spending. We used to be able to keep spending to somewhere between, I would say in the best years of the Clinton surplus, I think spending as a percent of GDP was like 18.8%. It's around 20% of GDP goes to federal spending. That was normal. But then the spending got out of control during COVID and it went up to like 25-30% of GDP went to federal spending. It's starting to come down, but it's still way too big a number. Anyway, my point is that a starting point for dealing with next year's budget is free spending, just free spending. The 18% increase is not a good idea. If we want to get this problem under control, freeze the spending. We can talk about taxation, but you're only going to get so much blood from a stone.
And increased spending is stimulatory, and so it works well in an election year. I would say we took two major crises and we had crisis level spending, and then we normalized that spending and allowed it to carry forward. Starting with the 2008 financial crisis with our monetary policy, and then being accelerated with COVID and our fiscal policy. I did some back of the envelope math. I'm sure there are economists who have done a better job of this than I. There are directly 3 million Americans that are directly employed by the federal government. There's 167 million workers in the US. So 3 million are directly employed by the federal government. If you take the rest of the federal spending that flows into the economy, it's about $3.5 trillion a year, and assume 30% of that capital goes to equity holders in businesses that own businesses that benefit from that spending, and the rest flows through to labor. That's about 13% of GDP flowing through to labor. And assuming average annual income, that's another roughly 50 million people that are directly benefiting, that are directly earning income because of federal spending. There's another 50 million people in the US that rely on Social Security. And here's another important statistic. There's somewhere between 12 and 20 million people in the US that pay more than 50% tax rate today. So those people are effectively working for the federal government because half of their income goes back to the government. So when you add this all up, there's over 120 million people in the US that are directly working for or getting paid by the federal government in the US. That is such a significant percentage of our economy. That is such a significant dependency on individual income on a federal government. I don't want to use the term socialism, but the ability for US labor to earn is so largely dependent and largely driven by federal spending at this point. It becomes this critical linchpin to enabling progression economically, to enabling the labor force to continue to participate, that the federal government is now the primary customer or employer of most of the labor force in the United States today. That is a deeply and profoundly different circumstance than what I think the founding fathers envisioned, when the federal government was supposed to be this lightweight, overseeing organization of a federated republic of states. And unfortunately, I think we find ourselves in a condition, as Jamal points out, that's very hard to get out of. This is going to require a dedicated multi-decade effort to create a slow unwinding from this deep dependency that our labor force has on federal spending. And I'm just so shocked that this isn't the critical problem of our day that we're not all spending time on. Folks have pointed out that this only goes one way at this point.
This is federal receipts as percent of GDP, and it goes all the way back to World War II. We've never gone above 20%. Look at that. And we've had tax rates as high as 90%. I'm saying top marginal tax rates as high as 90%, I think, after World War II, because we're trying to get out of the deficit that was created by the war spending.
You can't get above 20.
Yeah, exactly.
The economy shrinks.
No, but hold on. I gave you this OECD report. It says that since 2000, we've been in the mid-20s, and the OECD average is 34 in terms of tax to GDP.
Tax to GDP, this includes state and local then?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, I just showed federal.
I think this probably includes state and local, which, by the way, is a whole nother ballywag, because I didn't include those numbers in my employment statistics. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that about 20.2 million Americans are employed by local and state governments, directly employed by local and state governments. So again, when you add this all up, the majority of the U.S. labor force is employed by the government or is a beneficiary of the government as the primary customer or is supported by government entitlement programs.
If you go back to that Fred chart for a second, if you basically acknowledge the point that 20% is the ceiling on how much we can extract from an economy based on 80 years of data, okay, with all sorts of differing tax schemes, then I think what we should say is that federal spending will be capped at 20% of GDP.
Yep.
We should, you see what I'm saying? Like if we can't go above 20% on receipts, cap federal spending at 20%. That should be a
constitutional amendment.
And then on the revenue side, we should say, what is the best tax code to achieve that 18, 19, 20%? Because what we do right now is we just say, well, just tax the rich. But what we've seen is we've been taxing the rich as high as 90% in the past, and you didn't get more revenue. So we should be much more scientific about saying, well, given that our target is, let's say, 20%, what's the best way to do that? And no one really has that conversation.
No, none of the conversations have to do with data or building a bulletproof system. The same thing we could say about immigration, where we try to talk about the numbers here of what's a reasonable number of people and tying that to an actual number. And it's pretty obvious we should have one immigration policy when we have 5% unemployment and a different one if we had, God forbid, 15 or 20% unemployment. It could be tied to the unemployment rate.
Found this video insightful? Hit subscribe, turn the bell on, smash that thumbs up, and dive into the links in the description below. Join our vibrant community to ensure you never miss a video. Your generous support fuels our passion. Thank you for watching. We love you.